the mission became really clear, especially when we were writing your book. It's basically to send a message to my 18-year-old self to hopefully stop people from doing all the things that I did at 18. I really feel like I grew up always wanting to be skinnier, which I think a lot of specifically females can relate to. And it led to so many detrimental behaviors that really I had to pay for with long-term consequences for a long time. Extreme dieting, exercising twice a day, buying like mysterious pills from the GNC to burn fat, blah, blah, blah. All of these things. I think everything I do is kind of in service of that 18-year-old version of myself.
I love
And
that.
and for me, I come from a very different perspective, and that's working as a physician for now more than 30 years. I really have come to recognize many years ago that the things that are plaguing our patients are all of the chronic diseases that are the result of health choices, things that you talk about on your podcast about what we eat, how much sleep we get, our connections, how much exercise we get, whether we use substances. And those are the kind of things that people just need support around. They need guidance and it's some information. And then I think part of the magic is also through the podcast, through the forthcoming book, and through my practice, I really try to align the choices that individuals are going to make with what's most important to them as individuals. So you really have to know why you'd want to make a change. So I am trained to stick needles in people and to give them medications and to refer them on to surgery. And there's a place for that. But my mission is really to get out the word that we can take much better care of ourselves.
What is the connection between the two of you? Why did you start working together? Because it's such different sides of this wellness space.
Such a good question. So it's a fun story, guys. Okay, so basically what happened was when I graduated college, I was completely my major and what I've been doing in college was completely unrelated to the realms of health and fitness. But it had been an obsession of mine, like outside of school for years at that point. And when I graduated, I decided I wanted to work in the realm of fitness because it was something I was so passionate about. And I felt like I'd gone through so much with it, and so I sent out a bunch of cold emails to professionals in the health and fitness spaces. And one of them happened to be to an editor at Boston's NPR station. And so I went in for a meeting with her. I was basically telling her how, like, oh my God, like, I feel like there's so much misinformation in this space. And like, I used to do this, 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 and this. And like, this happened and whatever. And she said, wow, you seem really passionate about this. Would you like to write a blog for us? And I said, girl, it's not 2005. I want to do a podcast. And she was like, yeah, yeah, let's do it. Like, let's do a podcast. You have me audio experience. And I was like, no, but I can learn so fast and I love talking. So long story short, we decided to start a podcast. And pretty early on, like after I sent her my outline for the podcast, she was like, honestly, I think we need a second perspective here to like kind of be with you like on this journey, kind of guiding, but also kind of to be the voice of like a different generation as well. And like also give some authority. Cause at this point I was 23 years old. Like you know what I mean? Like, who's gonna listen to this 23-year-old be like, and this study says da 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 da. You know what I mean? And so she said, oh, I have this colleague, or I have somebody I know who I did a podcast with earlier. And Eddie can speak a little more to this, but it was called The Magic Pill. And so she said, he's great. Would you want to meet him? Maybe you guys could be co hosts. And I don't know. Eddie's just awesome. Like, people always ask me, like, what's Eddie like in real life? I'm like, Eddie is the same in real life as he is on the podcast. He's just so friendly and like,
But what's it like? Did you guys notice, especially in the beginning, because it's been a few years of doing the show, are there really noticeable generational differences about wellness, health, or body image that come up?
I think like to me, the bigger difference, even in the generational thing, is actually more of the gender thing. I think like my experience as a woman just has been so different than Eddie's, but I think he kind of gets to see it from the outside because he had two daughters who like, he raised. So with his wife, obviously. So like I feel like that to me is much more of a difference because I just don't see, and I'm not saying that men don't struggle with body image, of course they do, but I just think the kind of like just percolating and like just constant bombardment with like what your shape you're supposed to be, what size you're supposed to be, what weight you're supposed to be does happen a lot more to women as they grow up. the big difference in terms of how we experience health and fitness was really, to me, was more on a gender thing. But Eddie, I'm curious to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think the gender thing is big. I'm largely protected from social media, or I protect myself from it. So sometimes, there's something going on and like has to explain to me why this is blowing up, and why we should talk about this new weight loss drug because TikTok is blowing up, and I'm like, okay, if you say so.
Well, that was where I was gonna ask you too. One of the big questions is, how do you select which themes you're gonna include and which ones you're going to exclude? Keeping in mind you're trying to be really careful about how you speak about nutrition, body image, etc. Are there things that you make sure, okay, we're gonna do this in our season, in our episodes, and we're gonna avoid saying this?
We've always kind of come back to this idea of why are you making the health changes that you're making? And the reason is because so many of the detrimental behaviors I think I developed was because it was always only to try to lose weight. It was always in service of trying to be skinnier or look a certain way because I thought that was what would make me happy. And so I think something that we always come back to is like thinking about your why you should be making these changes, what are you actually trying to achieve, and like what does a healthy and happy life mean to you? Because if you reach your goal weight, but you're miserable and socially isolated and are terrified of food, then is like, are you really happy at that weight the way you thought you would be? Like, probably not, right? So I think that's something we come back to a lot. And we cover a lot of topics that I think are really sensitive for a lot of people. I mean, eating disorders is just the tip of the iceberg, but even just talking about weight stigma, health at every size, all of these things that really like emotionally hit people, we're always trying to be as sensitive as possible to our audience and also to grow and learn as like hosts as well. Like when I first started, like I got yelled at twice in the same day by different researchers I was interviewing. One for not using person first language and I was talking about obesity, and the other one for like not knowing that obesity was a disease that we should refer. And it's like, you know what I mean? So we're always like learning and trying to become better as well because so many of these topics are very emotionally fraught for everybody.
Yeah. Do you find what was your experience, Eddie, when you guys first started to, especially in the first season, and you are talking about some of these topics which are can be triggering for a lot of people, and you're hearing about Yuna's experience with it. Is there anything that surprised you, keeping in mind that you are a dad, you have girls, you're a doctor, so I'm sure you've heard these conditions, you've dealt with them, but was there anything that kind of surprised you at all?
That's a great question. I think that when we originally got started, the I would you and I were just getting to know each other, and just sort of hearing the angst of growing up in this society as a young woman, and then all of the things that Una just spoke about. And I am not trained in diagnosing disordered eating disorders. I It took me way too long to recognize it in my own daughter. The first season, which was released in 2020 before the pandemic, was much more appropriately, and it was planned like sort of Una's journey. And I think, at one point I was thinking like, all right, like, is there an eating disorder here? And if so, how's this going to work out? And you might want to talk about, or if you want to share, walking into the Harvard Health Service with a microphone, and sort of what transpired. It was sort of late in the season.
Yeah, so we were doing episode 8 of season 1. And that was the episode dedicated to eating disorders. And I felt this way similarly for the book as well. In both of these endeavors, like the podcast and the book, it's like we would start talking about these other topics like what to eat, stress, sleeping, exercise, blah, blah. And we would get to a chapter about eating disorders, and all of a sudden I would feel like this is the entire reason why I'm doing this. And like all these other topics I was circling around was like just like getting around the edges of this actual thing I wanted to talk about because it was so much more like it was so emotional for me to talk about this topic. And so I came into the interview like I do with all my other interviews. It was like, oh yeah, I kind of already know what I'm gonna ask, what they're gonna say. I've already done a lot of research on this, blah, 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 blah. And I was talking to the lady and I was just like, all I could think the entire time was like, oh my God, it's me. Oh my God, she's talking about me. Oh my God, that's what I do. That's what I say. That's how I think, you know? And so especially when she was talking about how people with eating disorders like really overvaluate their self-worth with their body shape and weight, and how she said oftentimes they feel like nothing else in their life is an accomplishment just because they haven't achieved their weight goal. At that point, I was like so like I felt like such a failure, and it was because 95% of my self-worth pie chart was coming from just my weight. And when she said that, I was like, "Oh my god, that's literally the story of my life of the past like 8 years." Like that is so me. And so like after I turned off the microphone, I was like, "Hey, so like how would I sign up to be a patient of yours?" Yeah, that was, like, the first time I actually, like, sought out professional help for an eating disorder, because I think I'd been really reluctant to, like, pursue treatment or even think that I had an eating disorder because I've never technically been underweight. And so I had this image in my head of people with eating disorders are really skinny, and I was never really skinny, so that's not me. And so, like, one of the biggest things I think we also try to dispel in the podcast and the book is that, like, an eating disorder does not have a certain look, a certain weight, a certain gender. It can really happen to anyone. It's really about your internal state and how you think about food, your relationship with food and your body more than it is how much you weigh.
Did you previous to this, did you suspect that you might have had an eating disorder, or were there things that you just weren't consciously admitting it, or was it that you just felt hesitant to seek help for it?
I think that I didn't think it was serious enough to be an eating disorder. I knew that I had a lot of obsessive tendencies around food, but I also followed so many fitness accounts that to me it seemed kind of normal for people that were into fitness. Like, tracking your food is very normal in fitness, and not going out to eat because you don't want to eat that food is very normal in fitness. And these are kind of things that I did all the time. But then, like, the facts that I would like not eat anything unless it had been weighed was like a step further than a lot of other people would take it. And I just wasn't really recognizing that like my behaviors were to another extreme. It was like on this spectrum that I thought was normal. And honestly, like I just think a lot of really abnormal behaviors are very normalized in extreme fitness spaces. Like binge eating is openly talked about and kind of like expected among people who compete in physique shows, right? After their show, they like usually have some sort of binge eating occurrence. And so like when I would binge eat, I just was like, oh, well, this happens to people who diet a lot. It's something that always happens. I didn't think it was that weird. And then like the more we would kind of like talk to other people, or the more I talked to more and more people about other experts about kind of not just eating disorders, but about all kind of spectrums of health, the more I realized like, oh no, this is a very niche part of the internet and it is not normal. Like it's just something that for some reason is on my For You page and my Explore page a lot and was giving me the impression that it was normal.
Another thing that sort of came along, and I can't remember exactly when. So I've long been interested in food and fitness, and in my own kind of male way. And along with my wife, we've tried many different kinds of diets and plans. And we raised our three kids with healthy food and a focus on healthy food. That led to what I now understand to be orthorexia. Ortho is like straight eating, that clean eating, at least in my middle daughter's case, translated into more obsessive clean eating to the point that she has, had her own eating disorder. And then as a parent saying, oh, dear God, I've learned just a ton emotionally and about the actual topics. And I love, what you were saying that, how we sort of skirted around for like 8 episodes, all of the other, stuff like let's talk about exercise and sleep and stress. And then, finally, let's get to where we've been headed this whole time. So, our podcast is not about eating disorders,
No.
but you still have to acknowledge that. Otherwise, so much of this world doesn't make sense.
Behaviors like exercise and making better food choices to me are so simple. Eat more whole foods. Like, enjoy your food. Allow yourself to have treats once in a while. Move your body. It's pretty straightforward. But, like, when it comes to people's motivations around these behaviors, I think is where it can get so complicated and difficult for people.
Yeah, you can know what to do, but it's not the same as all the baggage and behaviors that come with that, the insecurities. Like
Totally.
you can know to write a book, you sit down and write. it's not
Totally.
hard. But when you think about everything that comes with that, it's completely different.
Right?
How do you guys now, because you have touched on the eating disorder, even though it's not the main focus of the podcast, how do you tread the line between health and disordered? You know, I know that you talk a lot about this in the book, but what is the line that you're trying to walk here?
It is so difficult. I think that's like probably for me the most difficult thing to navigate. And just looking at the literature scientifically, like I try to look at it as objectively as possible. And in that lens, for example, just like one concrete example is that like ultra processed food in every study that's ever been run leads to basically every disease, right? Like increased ultra processed food consumption, which is like anything that's basically not a whole food, like cupcakes, cereal, sweetened coffees, whatever, right? Leads to increased cancer, heart attacks, all these things. I'm just the type of person that like I read something like that and my brain goes like, okay, never touch anything like that ever again. Like I'm a very black and white, all or nothing person, which is a trait, a predisposing trait of people with eating disorders often. And so, like, having to catch myself in that thinking and say, like, just because something is not optimal does not mean you do not do it 24/7 has been something I have to constantly remind myself. And like thinking about health as beyond just your physical, because like when I was really in the throes of my eating disorder, like I wouldn't have any desserts on my birthday. I would like go to gatherings in the holidays. My mom would make baklava. Like I said, we're Albanian. She'd always make homemade baklava for Christmas. And like, I would never eat it. I would never touch it. She would be like, "Why don't you have some? Why won't you have some bread? Why won't you have this?" And I'd be like, "No, I don't want it. No, I don't want it." And it would make me feel horrible. Like, I feel like I was hurting her feelings. I was upset myself because I like that stuff. And like, it just led to such terrible mental health that I was like, health is more than just how long you're going to live cancer free. Like, it's about enjoying your current reality. And so, I think anytime I catch myself drifting into obsession or my mental state being affected by my behaviors, like, is the way I'm eating making my life more stressful or less stressful? Is the way I'm exercising making my life more stressful or less stressful? Anytime I start to see it venturing towards that kind of obsessive quality, I have to like remind myself to pull back. And I think it's okay to fluctuate in terms of how strict you're being at certain periods of the year. Like there's just certain times where I'm really, really into my fitness. And so like I'm being more careful about eating more protein because I'm going to the gym a lot and I want my time in the gym to translate to like my actual results. You know, if I want to maximize, I want to have more protein. But there's also other times where I'm just like not caring and just eating whatever I want. And oftentimes that means I don't get enough protein because I just don't really like protein that much naturally. And that's okay too. I think it's okay to fluctuate, but it's like you have to be very self-aware of what type of person you are. And I just know I'm the type of person that often gets very obsessed with things and takes things too far. And so like you have to kind of keep an eye on yourself and your own thoughts and your own mental well-being.
It's not about like, oh, this is exactly the diet that I'm following. And if you did this, then you would, you would look like me. It's like, oh my God, you wouldn't want to look like me. So so that's not going to get us too far. So, we share our, frequently like, oh, like I really like coffee ice cream. And if it
Right.
has nuts and chocolate chips in it, just, don't get between me and the bowl of coffee ice cream with the nuts and chips in it. And I think it's actually kind of fun to lean into some of the kind of quote new stuff. I mean, just as an example, a couple of weeks ago, I was at a Healthy Kitchens course and I was listening to a researcher who looks into microbiota. That's the bacteria in our gut. And his big thing is all about the positive effects of fermented food. So he's presenting data that's just blowing the audience away. I'm texting you and like, we got to get this guy on the podcast. And then the next thing is like, I'm like digging into jars of sauerkraut and, because like I want to try it. And I can also report when we get to this episode that there's some downsides to eating a lot of sauerkraut. And so I think, part of it is like, you can't be like holier than thou. And we're not like trying to be strict, but just sort of like, hey, there's this thing about fermented foods. Like, like kombucha is kind of cool, except it's got a lot of sugar in it.
Right.
but it doesn't mean that it's bad, and it's just sort of like, it's the question that you're asking, Chardét, is like, so how do you find the middle ground? And that's the dance of life.
Yeah. Between the nutritional science and then the disorder. Yeah. I just find it fascinating because you, Una, are intimately acquainted with that experience. So it's one thing anyways to just talk about it and go on that line, but also to possibly be triggered by it. I don't know if you are anymore, but it's tough, right? To figure out, okay, well, this is good for you, and I'm all about the fermented foods. But then to understand that, yeah, like there's a way that you can go beyond eating sauerkraut every meal is not good for you.
Right. I'm at such a different point in my life than I was when we first started the podcast. Like when we first started the podcast, I hadn't had my period for 2 years. And I had gone to my endocrinologist and he was like, your hormones look like you're menopausal. Like, what's going on? Because my weight was not underweight, he didn't ask me at all about what I was eating. And he just said, like, yeah, you want control, basically was his solution because your hormones are messed up. And I was like, well, I'm doing these fasts like once a month, like, and he was like, well, how long are you doing them? And I was like, oh, 24-hour, 48-hour. And he was like, stop doing that. Why are you doing that? You need to stop, but like he didn't ask. And that was the point when we started the podcast. That's what I was doing. Like I was doing 1 day, 2 day long fasts once a month because I'd heard people in podcasts and on Instagram, whatever, say that fasting was good for you. And in the back of my mind, I also knew like I weighed 6 pounds less at the end of my 2 day fast. Even if it was water weight, like the scale was 6 pounds lower. And I've come so far from then to like, I mean, I've never fasted again since then, but also like I got my period back and it's the first time it's been consistent in my entire life. It's been consistent like since then. I've never missed it. So I just haven't been in that mental space in such a long time that a lot of time I'm like, oh yeah, like this isn't something I really have to worry about anymore. Like I'm healed in a sense. But I think a lot of people with eating disorders can relate to this. And it's like there will be things sometimes like even writing the eating disorders chapter in the book where it's like, it's hard for me to read it and I have to read it over and over and over again to edit it, because we have to do like the first pass, the second pass, the cold read reads it, the copy edit reads it. And I have to keep rereading the section. And I just like, every time I get to that part, my heart just thinks, I'm like, oh my God, here we go. I don't want to go through this again because it is such a like visceral, like experience in my life that was probably one of the worst things I've ever gone through, and I do find myself, like, still very, very emotionally affected by it, even if I don't think I exhibit a lot of the behaviors I used to.
Well, I mean, that's kind of like when you wrote this book, that was part of the reason, right? Was to be able to share what you wish you would have heard so that you wouldn't had to go through that
Yeah.
pain and that trauma that we carry with us for years. I mean, what was the kind of stuff that you both included in this book that you thought would be important to hear for a younger you? What was the
Yeah,
stuff that
so
mattered to you guys?
one of the things that I was worried about including in the book was we do talk a lot about weight loss a lot in the book, and I think if I had my way, I honestly would have people pursue lifestyle choices without weight loss being the immediate goal. And if weight loss came from the choices they were pursuing, that's fine. But if it didn't, it probably is still improving your health and it's also fine. And that would be the ideal route, I think, for everyone to take. However, I know that myself from ages 18 to 22, if that's how a book was marketed to me, I just wouldn't have cared. I wouldn't have read it. It wouldn't have mattered to me. And the only thing I cared about was weight loss. And so I really wanted in this book to like talk about how weight loss happens and demystify kind of all these things that I like thought about weight loss. Like I thought that certain people just had way faster metabolisms and that like there was something just wrong with me, which is why I was always bigger than my sisters. I thought there was something special about when people had these detox teas and like cayenne pepper, lemon juice, maple syrup, cleanses, all these things. I thought that like something special was in these ingredients that was causing your metabolism to speed up and that's how it would cause weight loss. I thought that like waist trainers actually did make your waist smaller. And keep in mind, like I am a well-educated person, I would say, and not to brag about myself. I'm just saying, like, I did go to college. My major was cognitive neuroscience, and I was still buying into these things that are like so not scientifically backed. Maybe partially because I wanted to believe it, but also partially because like they're very well marketed and people can hide behind scientific language in a lot of these things just because they know big words and the audience will not look into it. And so a lot of the book for me was like debunking these things that had seemed so ununderstandable to me and so like magical almost. Like the weight loss pills seemed magical because I'd seen Dr. Oz talk about Garcinia Cambogia. He's a doctor and he's on TV. He must know what he's talking about. So of course I didn't look into the studies myself. Like, why would I waste my time? Right. But like when you look into these things, like nothing actually works like that.
Was talking about sort of the emotional part of disordered eating. And in writing the book, we, just like the first season of the podcast, we sort of delayed this discussion about eating disorders until sort of later in the book. And much of the book is written as sort of like the lead, and then I respond, from a doctor's view, from a dad's view, etc. And I naively thought, oh, I'm going to write a couple of paragraphs just by like asking my daughter, who's Yuna's age, so what was your experience like having anorexia? Like idiot, like, that's going to be, 2 paragraphs. And it turned into, I maybe like one of the longest chapters of the book,
Yeah.
because guess what? She had questions for me. Like, what were mom and you thinking? And, why didn't you do this? And why did you do that? And it's just like, it's still, I was just sort of being emotionally evoked. I was cringing when I was reading, like, oh yeah, I've had to reread that chapter a half dozen times now. And just kind of saying, do I look, as stupid as I was in terms of, just like seeing it, like disordered eating is so prevalent and it's so much part of the culture that when someone's sitting at our dinner table exhibiting it, we just kind of like, oh, you're tapering for a swim meet. Of course you're not eating. Like, what?
There's a disconnect between, or because the behavior is so normalized, it doesn't seem like it's disordered. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
become, that's what Yuna was speaking to. It's become not just in the fitness community, it's become completely, it's become part of the culture, just sort of like, eat what you will, and then you can take, thus and such and skinny down and move on.
I
Yeah.
would just wanted to quickly ask Eddie your opinion on this, because since you guys are talking about the science of weight loss and fat loss, and like you mentioned, having that, hearing certain doctors talk about some things which are really not, I don't know the best word to say it, but they're just not healthy for long-term sustainability. How do you feel, Eddie, about that? Being in the medical profession, knowing what they know.
I don't really understand it, except that doctors, like other people, are drawn to, oh, I want to, get more likes on my posts. I want to have more listeners on my podcast. I want to sell more books. I want to, be on television. And snake oil's been sold for hundreds of years, maybe longer. I don't know, it goes way back. And there's some sort of motivation. I don't understand it. I think there's enough knowledge out there to share with people, and I don't feel diminished in any way. In fact, I feel much better by getting my patients to do healthy things. And believe me, there's no greater joy than someone who has listened enough, has tried enough, has found out why they want to make changes, and then they say, I guess, do I really have diabetes anymore? Like, I'm not taking insulin anymore. I'm not taking metformin anymore. I just cut out, the garbage and started lifting weights. And I go like, well, we say you've reversed diabetes. We're still going to keep it on your list. Like what more does a doctor want to hear than someone whose life has been changed from a few conversations and a little bit of guidance? I mean, that's enough for me.
This kind of leads to the one big question for you guys. The last question before we ask how people can find you is, what do each of you hope that someone takes from this book? What's most important for you?
For me, the most important thing, and this is something that I wish I had kind of thought of earlier, is that any sort of behavior change that comes out of self hatred is doomed to fail. And I think everything I did in my like late teens to early 20s came out of a sense of self loathing. And like, I mean, it was to the point where like I didn't want to touch my body. I didn't like zipping up my jacket because I meant that to touch my stomach. Like I walked around permanently sucking in my stomach. Like I don't even know how to like sit or stand normally without doing that, you know? It was such a like pervasive sense of like I hate my body and like you're in your body all day long 24/7. And to have that kind of sense of self-loathing, it's impossible for it not to creep into every sense you have of yourself beyond just your physical self. And so I think I learned that like making changes out of self-love is not only going to be a more enjoyable process, but is also a process that will probably last for the rest of your life. Whereas something that's like fueled by such a toxic fuel as hatred is like bound to burn out because you just can't sustain it for that long. And I think like it doesn't matter if it's a health behavior or some other sort of behavior, any change I make from that point on in my life has been out of caring for myself and not trying to change myself because I don't like myself.
So, in answer to the question, I first want to share the full title of the book because part of my answer lies within Food We Need to Talk, the science based, humor laced last word on eating, diet, and making peace with your body. And I love the idea that, a little bit tongue in cheek, we want to be the last word. We want the readers to listen to the stories, laugh along with us, become better educated, and then maybe, just maybe, be less susceptible to being sucked into the next fad diet, detox, herb that's just been discovered. Hello. That has to be mixed, as Una described, with just the right amount of maple syrup and cayenne pepper to match, like maybe you'll read that last word and now have enough knowledge. And if you're not listening to the nonsense out there, maybe your stress level will go down. And we really want it to be a chance to reframe and rethink all of the things that we've been talking about, the external motivators. Do I have to look a certain way for my fill in the blank here? You my blank social media feed, or for the wedding coming up. It's also a chance for us to go a little bit deeper than a 30-minute podcast because you only get so many words. So we really get to dive in. And I think just the last thought is that we really don't give prescriptions. We don't give recipes. We just want you to understand how your body works, to understand and really relish in how exquisite our metabolism is. And as long as you just feed it the right way and give it a little bit of rest and maybe calm your mind, you're going to be, as Eunice, like happier and healthier.
Where can people find the book and your podcast and connect with you? Because you're right. In this small little episode, there's a lot of answers not given yet, right? There's a lot more to know about this. So where can they find all those resources and connect with you guys?
So you can find Food We Need to Talk on all podcast platforms. You can also find us on our website, foodweneedtotalk.com. There's links there to all the episodes, all the platforms, as well as the book. There are over 300 references in that book. It's a thing that we've worked, at least for me, I've worked hardest on in my life. I don't know. I'm sure Eddie's worked on things that harder before because he's lived a long time in a good way.
Raising kids.
It's a thing I've worked hardest on in my life. I'm so proud of it. And you can find us on Instagram at Food We Need to Talk. My socials are linked there, but more importantly, the podcast social is linked there. So
Amazing. We'll include links to everything in the show notes. And thank you both for coming on the show and sharing the message we need more of in this space.
thank you, Chardét.
Thank you. Thank you so much.